Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. You're sitting in a cold, dimly lit cell. The echo of the metal door slamming shut isn't just loud, it's final. That sound in that moment wasn't the prison gate closing, it was the sound of my excuses being silenced. I never thought I'd end up there. Prison wasn't part of the plan. But here's the truth: life doesn't care about your plans, it cares about your actions. And my actions landed me there. I thought I could outsmart life, outmaneuver accountability. I was wrong. Today, I'm not here to glamorize the past or sugarcoat the mistakes I made. I'm here to talk about failure. Because prison wasn't just a cell, it was my wake up call. My biggest failure wasn't being locked up, it was thinking I was untouchable, invincible, above consequence. But here's why you need to hear this whole story. What happened in that cell wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. In this speech, I'll take you through how I faced my darkest moments head on, what I learned when everything was stripped away, and how I found strength not in my freedom, but in my choices. By the end of this, I promise you'll see that failure is never final. In fact, it's the greatest teacher life has to offer. Imagine this: you're sitting in a cold, dimly lit cell, the concrete walls closing in around you. The air feels heavier than it should, and every sound seems amplified. The shuffle of footsteps, the clank of metal keys, the slam of a heavy steel door. That door doesn't just shut with a bang, it shuts with finality, with a weight that presses on your chest. That sound wasn't just the end of my freedom, it was the end of my illusions. In that moment, I wasn't just a man in prison. I was a man staring directly at the consequences of every choice I had made up to that point. Choices that weren't just mistakes, but willful acts of arrogance, entitlement, and self delusion. You see, prison didn't happen to me. I walked right into it, step by step, decision by decision, thinking the rules didn't apply to me. And let me tell you, realizing I was my own executioner, that was a truth colder than the cell I was locked in. And to detach from my life. Most people think failure is some grand sudden event, but the truth is it's rarely a single moment. My failure didn't start when the verdict was read. It started long before, in the small, everyday decisions I made that I thought didn't matter. I ignored the warnings, dismissed the consequences, and convinced myself I was untouchable. I was building my own prison brick by brick, and by the time the bars closed around me, I had no one to blame but myself. Now, here's the hook. That cold, stark realization was the moment my life began to change. Because while that slam of the door felt like the end, it was actually the start of something far more important. It stripped away the noise, the lies I'd told myself, and forced me to confront the raw, ugly truth. I had failed miserably, epically. But failure wasn't just my enemy, it was my greatest teacher. Here's the thing: prison wasn't just the place where I lost my freedom, it was a crucible where I found something I'd lost long before: my integrity, my humility, my sense of purpose. Sitting in that cell, I had no distractions, no place to hide. For the first time, I had to face myself, and it wasn't a pretty sight, but it was real. And that's where the transformation began. So why should you care? Because you don't have to end up in a cell to feel trapped. Maybe you're locked in a cycle of bad decisions, stuck in a situation that feels hopeless, or just carrying the weight of your own failures. But let me tell you something. Failure doesn't have to be the end of your story. In fact, it can be the most powerful beginning if you let it. Stay with me, because what I learned behind those bars isn't just about survival. It's about redemption, growth, and the kind of strength that can only be forged in fire. And that strength, it's something you can find too. When I look back on everything that led to me being locked up, the most powerful realization I had wasn't about the mistakes I made. It was about the responsibility I didn't take earlier. It's easy to point fingers. It's easy to blame the system, other people, or even circumstances for the way our lives turn out. But what I discovered sitting there in that cold cell was that nothing in my life had happened to me without my own hand in it. In prison, I didn't have anyone to answer to except myself. There were no distractions, no one to impress, no one to hide behind. And for the first time, I was forced to take a hard look at who I was and what I had become. There was no escaping the truth. I had made those choices. those mistakes, and the responsibility was mine. I had been playing a dangerous game of denial, convincing myself that the things I'd done were just part of life, just part of the hustle, and minimized my actions, justified them, and found reasons why they weren't so bad. But sitting there, facing the harsh reality, I couldn't avoid it anymore. Taking full responsibility meant acknowledging not just the bad decisions, but the underlying issues that had led to them. I convinced myself that I was invincible, that I could bend the rules without facing consequences. I didn't want to accept that my choices had real, sometimes devastating impacts on the people around me and ultimately on myself. The moment I owned up to that was the moment my mindset began to shift. I stopped looking for excuses and started looking for solutions. For so long, I'd blamed everything but myself, but other people's actions, bad luck, or circumstances beyond my control. It's what many of us do when we're too scared to admit that the person we need to change is ourselves. But I realized that the key to my own growth wasn't in the outside world, it was in my own decisions. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's the one that set me free. Taking responsibility was my first step towards redemption. And it didn't come easy. It meant acknowledging the mistakes I'd made and accepting the consequences. But the real power came from this. I stopped being a victim of my circumstances and started becoming the creator of my future. No longer was I at the mercy of anyone else's actions. I was in control. That shift in mindset was monumental. It wasn't about sitting around feeling sorry for myself or complaining about the past. It was about taking ownership of everything, good and bad, that had happened to me and using that ownership as the foundation to rebuild my life. It was hard work and it took time. But the most important thing was that I stopped waiting for someone else to fix things for me. I knew that I was the only one who could do that. There's one thing I learned from this journey. It's that taking full responsibility for your life is the most empowering thing you can do. It's not about blame, it's about power. When you accept that you're in control of your choices, you also realize that you're in control of your future. That realization was the first step to me breaking free, both mentally and physically, from the prison I had built around myself. Hitting rock bottom, especially in a place like prison, feels like the kind of ending that could define your entire life. But I'll tell you something, it wasn't an end at all. It was the beginning of my most profound transformation. In that small, lonely cell, everything was stripped away. My freedom, my distractions, the false identity I had built around myself. I was left with nothing but the raw, unfiltered reality of who I was and the choices I had made to get there. And in that vulnerability, I found an unexpected gift, a chance to rebuild from the ground up. It wasn't easy. At first, the idea of rebuilding seemed absurd. How do you rebuild your life when the pieces feel broken beyond repair? How do you make something meaningful out of the ruins of your past? But the thing about rock bottom is that it forces you to stop pretending. There's no room for ego, no space for excuses. You either accept that you're completely at your lowest, or you begin to find the strength to rise again. And that's exactly what I did. I chose to rise. What I found in that decision wasn't just the will to survive. I found the clarity to understand my true purpose. Prison wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a place of reflection. In those quiet, empty moments, I started to see the bigger picture. I wasn't just serving time in a cell, I was serving time with myself, figuring out who I really was and what I truly wanted from life. I took responsibility for my past, but more importantly, I started focusing on my future. I set goals, no matter how small they seemed. I pushed myself to read, to learn, to grow in ways I'd neglected for years. There was no longer any excuse to sit in despair. I realized that even though I couldn't control the circumstances that put me behind bars, I could control how I responded. And that control became my greatest asset. The most powerful lesson I learned behind those bars wasn't just about surviving prison, it was about thriving despite it. It was about resilience, the kind of resilience that's forged not in comfort, but in adversity. The power to push through, to reinvent yourself when everything around you suggests that you should give up. I began to understand that the most valuable thing in life isn't external success or possessions, it's internal strength. The strength to keep going, even when everything feels like it's falling apart. Began setting goals that challenged me, not just in the physical sense, but mentally and emotionally. I committed to becoming better than I was yesterday, no matter how small the steps were. I wasn't just preparing to leave prison, I was preparing to leave behind the person that I'd been before I walked in. And with each step I took, I realized that no matter where you are, no matter how deep you've fallen, there's always a way up if you choose to find it. And I now look at failure differently. It's no longer something to be feared or avoided. It's something to embrace, because it's in our failures that we truly discover who we are and what we're made of. Rock bottom is not the end of your story. It's the foundation for something stronger, something greater. When you choose to rebuild, you start not just with a new vision, but with a new sense of who you are and the power to shape your own destiny. Shame's a powerful emotion. It's the kind of feeling that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, suffocating your thoughts and making you believe that you're not worthy of redemption. When I first entered prison, shame was all I felt. I was embarrassed, humiliated, and paralyzed by the idea that I had failed not only myself, but everyone who had ever believed in me. It's the kind of weight that pulls you down, makes you question if you're even capable of rising again. But here's the truth about shame: it's not permanent unless you allow it to be. I could have chosen to remain in that place, to wallow in self pity and let it define the rest of my life. I could have let it define the rest of my life and how I interacted with the world. But the more I sat with my shame, the more I realized it didn't have to define me. It could empower me. In the darkest moments of my incarceration, I began to view my shame as a fire, one that could either consume me or forge me into something stronger. At first, I was consumed. I wanted to hide, to retreat from everything that reminded me of the person I used to be. But then something changed. I realized that this shame wasn't a sign of my unworthiness. It was a sign of my humanity. It was proof that I cared, that I still had something inside me worth fighting for. The problem wasn't that I had failed. It was that I had allowed that failure to control me for too long. Redemption doesn't happen in a moment. It's a slow process, a journey. And it begins with forgiveness, first forgiving yourself. I had to forgive myself for the mistakes I made, for the damage I caused, for the lives I affected. But more than that, I had to forgive myself for letting shame take hold of me for so long. The moment I allowed myself to release that shame was the moment I started to reclaim control over my life. Shame is often tied to our pride, and pride can be a powerful barrier. It's hard to admit you were wrong, especially when you've spent so much time pretending to be something you're not. But letting go of that pride, confronting your mistakes head on, and learning to forgive yourself is an incredibly freeing process. It's like taking a deep breath after holding it in for far too long. When I let go of my shame, I finally felt like I could breathe again. But it wasn't just about feeling better emotionally, it was about taking real action. Redemption isn't just an internal process, it requires tangible steps. And the most important of those steps was to use my shame as fuel. I made a decision that I wasn't going to let my past be the end of my story. I wasn't going to let it define me. Instead, I chose to turn it into the driving force behind everything I did. Each day in prison, I worked to become better than I was yesterday, to repair the damage I had done, and to show myself that I was capable of more than my past mistakes. The journey to redemption isn't easy, but it's worth it. It's about using your shame not as a burden, but as a reminder that you're human and that every mistake is an opportunity to grow. By confronting your past head on and forgiving yourself, you make room for healing. And through that healing, you begin to unlock the person you were always meant to be, a person who is not defined by their failures, but who rises above them. When you're in a place like prison, you're forced to face some of the harshest truths about yourself, truths that on the outside you might never have been ready to confront. But in that confined space with nothing but time and silence around you, those truths come to the surface whether you're ready for them or not. It's not just about the rules you've broken or the mistakes you've made. It's about the deeper lessons that emerge when you're stripped down to your core. And for me, one of the most profound lessons I learned behind bars was about discipline, resilience, and clarity. Lessons that shaped not only my survival, but my ability to thrive despite my circumstances. Discipline isn't just about following rules. It's about creating structure in your life, even when everything seems out of control. In prison, structure is forced upon you, but it's also an opportunity to embrace it, to find routine in a place that feels inherently chaotic. In those early days, I was lost. I had no sense of purpose, no direction, and it felt like my world was spinning out of control. But over time, I realized that I had the power to create my own order. I began setting small goals, goals that were simple but meaningful, like making my bed every morning, sticking to a workout routine, or reading a book a week. These small acts of discipline became the foundation of everything else. They gave me a sense of control in an environment where everything else felt unpredictable. Resilience is a lesson I learned through pure necessity. The mental and emotional weight of being incarcerated is immense. Some days feel unbearable and the urge to give up is strong, but through those moments of weakness, I found the strength to push through, to remind myself that just because something is hard doesn't mean it's impossible. Each time I got knocked down, I made the decision to get back up, no matter how many times it took. It wasn't about being invincible, it was about being relentless. It's about bouncing back every time life tries to break you, because you know that every setback is just a setup for a comeback. Prison taught me how to fight when everything within me wanted to surrender. Clarity, on the other hand, came slowly. When you're consumed by regret and shame, it's hard to see anything beyond your mistakes. But over time, I gained a new perspective. The walls that confined me physically also gave me the mental space I needed to reflect on my life, my actions, and my purpose. With that clarity, I was able to make sense of everything that had led me to prison, not just the legal consequences, but the choices I had made that put me on that path. I began to understand the person I had been, and more importantly, I started to see who I wanted to become. That clarity became my guiding light. It wasn't an instant revelation, but it was a gradual process of peeling back layers, confronting my past, and discovering the potential I still had within me. These lessons, discipline, resilience, and clarity, they're invaluable. They're not just lessons for surviving prison, they're lessons for life. Whether you're in a physical prison or a mental one, these principles can help you break free. Life is full of challenges and you'll face times when things seem insurmountable, but the ability to remain disciplined in your approach, resilient in the face of adversity, and clear about your goals and your purpose can make all the difference. The biggest lesson I learned behind bars is that you can either let your circumstances define you or you can define your circumstances. Through these lessons, I chose to define mine, and that's what made all the difference. The hardest thing in life isn't failure itself, it's the fear of failure. It's the voice inside your head that tells you that no matter how hard you try, you'll never be good enough. That fear can be paralyzing, making you hesitate, holding you back from taking risks or pushing forward. But one of the most valuable lessons I learned from my time in prison was how to embrace failure, not as something to fear, but as a stepping stone to success. In prison, couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. I had already hit rock bottom and there was nowhere lower to go. That realization forced me to confront my fears head on, not to avoid them. Fear, I realize, is something we let control us when we're not prepared to face it. But once you step into your fear, once you acknowledge it and take action anyway, it loses its power. It's when you run from it, when you avoid it, that it controls you. So I started challenging myself. I took on tasks that intimidated me. I set goals that scared me. In prison, there are no easy wins. Everything is hard. Everything requires effort and patience. But through those challenges, I realized that every time I faced a fear and came out the other side, I grew stronger. And each failure I encountered became a lesson rather than a setback. I began to understand that failing doesn't make you a failure. Failing is simply part of the journey. The key isn't avoiding failure, it's learning from it. I remember the first time I attempted something that I'd never tried before, reading a complex book or learning a new skill. The fear of failure was overwhelming. What if I couldn't understand it? What if I failed at something else? But I pushed through that initial discomfort. And by the end of it, not only had I learned something new, but I had also gained the confidence that I could try again, no matter the outcome. This mindset shift wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The fear of failure can paralyze you, but once you let go of that fear, something remarkable happens. You unlock your potential. You realize that the possibility of success is far greater than the certainty of failure. You begin to understand that it's not about the end result, it's about the growth that happens along the way. I know that many of you, whether in your personal lives or your careers, have faced your own version of failure. Maybe you're facing a mountain that seems impossible to climb. Maybe you're stuck in a cycle of doubt, afraid to take the next step. But here's the truth. Failure isn't the end. It's the beginning of something greater. Every time you fall, you have a choice to stay down or to get back up and try again. The power lies in your ability to embrace that failure, to learn from it, and to keep moving forward. So I challenge you to look at your own failures, not as obstacles, but as opportunities. Opportunities to grow, to evolve, and to redefine what success means to you. Failure doesn't define you, your ability to rise from it does. And that's the real test. Are you ready to face your fears, to accept failure as part of your journey, and to keep moving forward? Because when you do, you'll realize that failure is not something to fear, it's something to embrace. It's a vital part of the process that leads to true success.